Hey everyone, today we're going to be looking at epistemology. This is a philosophical subdiscipline that investigates the nature of knowledge, belief, and justification. And there's a lot with it, right? I've probably simplified too much trying to condense it into a lecture or two, but there's some really interesting stuff in here. It can get somewhat abstract, okay? So to begin, I want you to consider this quote. Okay? The quote is, "Knowledge is cruel. It will break your heart and test your allegiances. Are you sure you want this curse?" Right? When I first heard this quote, right, it was, it's a very provocative quote, right? We're typically told that, knowledge is a good thing, that's something we should strive for, but we don't always consider, right, the impacts that it has in real life. And I think it is important to consider those impacts, before we start talking about it in perhaps an abstract way, right? I think it can have this effect. I think there's something to this quote. And again, I hope that grounds the discussion that we're going to have today. All right. So as we go through today, I hope to return to this idea, right? But I hope it sets the stakes for us, right? Why is knowledge worth studying? And that's because it's powerful. Right? It can challenge our loyalties, our identities. It can shape and break relationships, right? So before we begin, I also thought it was funny to share, where did I first hear this quote? This is not Plato, this is not Aristotle. I read it from the flavor text of a Magic the Gathering card when I was a teenager. So just goes to show you, you can find philosophy anywhere if you're looking for it. All right. So again, to simplify things today, because there's a lot to talk about, there are a number of different kinds of knowledge, right? We have propositional, procedural, and even knowledge by acquaintance. For the purposes of today's lecture, I'm only going to talk about propositional knowledge. But if you are interested in, knowing about different other types of knowledge, please do check out the textbook that I've linked for this week, because it's interesting stuff. Okay, so propositional knowledge is knowing that, right? This is the knowledge of true and false propositions. Okay, so I have some examples for you here, right? This is supposed to say water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level. That is true, right? Unicorns exist. That is, as far as we know, false, right? And 2 + 2 = 4. That's a kind of proposition, and it's true, right? So propositions are statements about the way things are, and they can either have a true truth value or a false truth value, right? True or false for either one of these. Okay, this might open up a whole other can of worms, though. What does it mean for something to be true? Certainly with our previous lecture in mind regarding what can we know, right? This is a pertinent question. Okay, so when it comes to truth, I'm again going to simplify this a little bit. I'm going to talk about the correspondence theory of truth, or I'm going to be using the correspondence theory of truth today, and that's basically the idea that a statement is true if it corresponds with reality, right? So there's a statement, and then there's the way the world is, and if those two things are the same, it's true, okay? I know it's crazy that we could even debate about what is true, but hopefully that feels intuitive into as a theory of truth. And that's what we're going to be using for today. Okay. So now we have what we need to understand Plato's definition of knowledge. Okay. This definition of knowledge stood for nearly 2,000 years, right? Everyone agreed, yeah, Plato got this right. It is a remarkably, cogent argument about what knowledge is. And it was only until the 20th century, right? The 1900s. There's this guy, Edmund Gettier. He wrote a paper that introduced a lot of doubt into actually if this is a correct definition of knowledge, right? And I think it's so cool. He did this in 3 pages. He overturned 2,000 years of everyone thinking Plato was right. He did it in 3 pages. I just thought that's kind of cool. Okay. That being said, if it stood for 2,000 years, it's pretty dang good. So let's talk about what it is. Plato's definition of knowledge is JTB, justified true belief. Okay, so to put it somewhat more formally, person S knows proposition P if and only if 1, P is true. The proposition must be true. 2, S believes P, And 3, S is justified in believing P. Okay? Now, all of these, 1 through 3, are necessary conditions for knowledge, right? They must be there in order for someone to have knowledge. If even one is missing, right, a person does not have knowledge. Together, the idea is that they fully describe what it is to know something, right? They're sufficient to define knowledge, okay? So necessary and sufficient conditions are something that philosophers often talk about, and here's an example of that, okay? All right, let's try to unpack this definition a little bit and see why each and every one of these components is necessary and why together they might be jointly sufficient. Okay, so an example that I use is, right, I want you to make a guess about what kind of phone I have in my pocket right now. Okay, I do have a phone in my pocket, and it is described by this list, right? It is either an iPhone, it is an Android, or it is neither, right? Interestingly, this list of 3 things encapsulates everything in the universe, right? So it is on this list somewhere, right? Everything in the universe is either an iPhone, an Android, or neither of those things, okay? So make a guess right now, maybe even write it down, right? What's your guess? What kind of phone do I have? And if you want to think about this for later, think about why you made that guess, right? Was there any particular reason why you chose one over the other? That'll be important later, okay? So make your guess. All right. So the first thing that we should note, right, these 3 options can be expressed in the form of propositions, right? 1, Professor Law has an iPhone. Professor Law has an Android. Professor Law has neither, okay? Now, 2 of these propositions are false, right? Only one of them is going to be true. So the question we have here is, do people who guessed a false proposition have knowledge about my phone, right? Someone's going to be wrong here. Do they have knowledge, right? Some people have guessed correctly. So maybe they have knowledge. But consider, do the people who guessed the wrong one have knowledge about my phone? Well, probably not, right? There's this hopefully illustrates the truth component of Plato's definition, okay? Okay. Now, I also want you to think, I guess I'll tell you, right? I have an Android, so hooray if you got that right. No worries if not, okay? So if you did guess that correctly, right? Did you have knowledge about my phone? Well, probably not either, right? Because you guessed to get that answer, right? You could have just as easily guessed something else, and that's, we don't tend to think that guessing is a good way to get to knowledge, right? It just as easily gets you to anti-knowledge, right? Something that's not knowledge, as it does the real thing, right? In this example, right, it's only 1/3 of the time does guessing get you to knowledge, right? And normally we want better odds than that to think that someone has knowledge, okay? So we have a variety of paths to justification, some of which we think are better than others, okay? So, for instance, right, you may have guessed that I have an iPhone, right? You may have used statistical inference. You might know, right, that I think 60% of the market share, right, in the United States, people have iPhones. 60% of people who have smartphones have iPhones, right? That's better, right? That's better than 1/3. That's nearly 2/3, right? So you might have guessed iPhone, right? Did you have knowledge? Well, no, right? Because it was wrong. Your guess may have been justified, but it was still wrong, okay? So again, hopefully this illustrates both the importance of justification, why we think that's a necessary component of knowledge. You need to believe it for the right reasons. You need to have a reason to think it is rather than just guessing, right? Just as random chance. And it needs to correlate with reality, okay? Okay, so now I hope to have illustrated 2 of the components, right? I've talked about truth and I've talked about justification, okay? So presumably you have most of the ingredients here for knowledge, right? The proposition, Professor Law has an Android, is true, right? Corresponds with reality, right? You can justify believing it because now you've seen it, right? And I'm telling you what it is, and hopefully, right, you think I'm trustworthy, right? And you right? Why is believing an important part of this this definition? Well, that's because, knowledge is not contained in books, right? Information is. Knowledge is only contained in people, right? For you to have knowledge, you must believe it, right? There has to be a proposition which you feel some type of way about, right? That may be justified or not how you feel, but you have to believe it in order for it to be your knowledge, right? Okay, so hopefully, again, this illustrates why all three of these are necessary and sufficient for knowledge, right? If you have all of these, it seems quite reasonable that you know something, okay? Now, if this feels pedantic, it may be, right? But it hopefully also gets us some conceptual clarity, right? Because there is a problem here, right? If we've defined what knowledge is, right? We have good conceptual clarity about what this thing is, right? Maybe it's this, the thing that I described at the beginning, this thing that has power, that can break your heart, that could test allegiances. We know what it is, right? The question is, can we get it, right? Well, no, I don't think we can, right? And so if you remember Descartes and his thought experiment from last lesson, right? His thought experiment, the purpose of that was to establish a universal belief falsifier, right? This was either the evil genius thought experiment that Descartes here proposed. This could be the butterfly thought experiment that Zhuangzhou proposed, or any number of modern iterations on this topic, right? But the point is that you can't necessarily believe your eyes. You can't necessarily believe what I'm saying here, because couldn't that just be the result of the evil genius manipulating your brain to have you think that way, right? You can apply this sort of doubt to anything, right? It seems like any kind of justification. And the problem is, I'm able to show you the phone, and at least for our purposes here, right? This was what made that statement true, but we cannot corroborate, right? We cannot verify that, I have this outside of human experience, right? We're very limited by our human experience, and so all we really have of that previous definition, right, is justification and belief. We have a set of beliefs that are maybe more or less justified with the other, right? They may correlate with what we're experiencing, right? The correlative, correspondence theory of truth, right? It may seem to correlate with truth, correspond to truth, but we can't verify that it actually does, right? So here's the problem, right? We've defined something, right? We've defined knowledge. We all agreed that was a pretty good definition, and it seems like we can't get it, right? So it's at this point, my wife, who's a trained scientist, she practices medicine. She's wondering, what do we have if we don't have knowledge, right? Why even bother, Mr. Philosopher Man, defining knowledge if we don't have it? If it's impossible for humans to get, why are we bothering talking about it, right? Well, yeah. Clearly we're still doing something though, right? Clearly we're still talking about medicine, right? We're still doing science, and you're learning something in school, right? At least we hope you are. What is it that you are learning if not knowledge, right? Well, it might, my wife and I are workshopping some terms here, but knowledge light, right? Diet knowledge, right? These are things that, we seem to be doing something important, right? There seems to be that some of this knowledge light is better justified than others. Certain beliefs seem to be more justified than others. We still seem to want to talk about truth and knowledge, but given this definition that Plato has given us, right, it doesn't seem like we can get there, right? So this is something that I want you to consider for this week anyways. Right? If we don't have knowledge, what do we have, right? Okay, so I'm going to stop there for a moment. There are a number of other interesting epistemological mysteries that we might look into. For instance, right, the chief one is, if not knowledge, what do we have? We might want to think about what is worth knowing, right? Given two important facts. One is that you cannot know everything. Even if we're defining knowing now in terms of this diet knowledge, right? There's so much information out the world, your brain has some limitations into what you can put in it, right? There's also some things that you presumably don't need to know, right? Or it wouldn't serve anyone well to know those kinds of things, right? We could all, easily go to Galveston together, right? We find some kid's sandcastle and we start counting the grains of sand in that sandcastle, right? The proposition of the number of grains of sand in that kid's sandcastle is knowable, right? At least in this diet sense, which I'm kind of using by default from here on out, right? That is knowable, but who cares, right? So given those two facts, that your ability to know is finite, given your mental limitations as well as the finitude of your own life, as well as there's lots of things out there that doesn't seem to be worth knowing, right? And then the final thing that we might talk about a little bit more is this last question, right? What if I know something but can't remember right now? I don't know if you've ever had that where maybe you're taking a test and you see the question and you're thinking and you're like, this is on the tip of my tongue, I know this, but you can't remember, right? And maybe after the test, you go have lunch or you take a nap and suddenly you wake up and then now you can remember, right? You do seem to know something, right? But you didn't know it on the test. So is there something wrong with testing, right? Is this a serious oversight in education that, we think we're testing our students on knowledge, but really we're testing them on what they can remember in a very small snapshot of time, right? It's unclear how much epistemology should accommodate the kinds of epistemic agents we are, right? Which is highly fallible, forgetful, subject to being hungry and tired, right? Should we just be concerned with knowing for its own sake, or should we be thinking about human knowledge and human limitations, right? That's an ongoing tension in the field of epistemology. So hopefully this has been a good introduction to epistemology, some of the terms, some of the worries that epistemologists deal with, and hopefully it also gives some weight, right, to why would we study these things. These are tough problems, but they really matter, right? What we can know, what we believe, and what we can end up justifying ends up having a big impact on our lives. So that's why it seems worth studying, and that's why it seems worth investigating some of these other problems.